I'm sure many of you have gone through buying a new land, leasing new land, hunting on new land, and you've had a checklist that you're wondering about. What do you do first? And I run into this all the time with clients. People that ask this question, what's going to give me my most bang for my buck? And I firmly believe in the 80-20 rule, the 20-80 rule, where you're doing 20% of the work to accomplish 80% of your success. A lot of people are doing it in reverse. They're accomplishing 80% of the work for 20% of the success. And that's why I have this listed from first year to second year. This is following the progression of what we're doing on our current land here in Minnesota. And we're actually adding some acres to that. We'll talk about that in the future. And it's the same thing. I'm looking at it, I'm stepping back. Even on that addition of the new land, I'm stepping back. I'm looking at it as a first year, even though it combines to the other land. And then we'll step up to those second year projects in third year, fourth year, because sometimes these second year ones kind of extend out for several years. But I look at it like you can't afford, and I know we couldn't afford not to do these things right here in year one, and I'm going to talk about why. These allowed us to transform the property and turn it into what we wanted, and to reach that 80% of the success right off the bat with doing targeted habitat improvements that I felt had to be done in order for us to take those steps. Number one, this first year, food plots, critical on private land. No different than if you're looking and scouting on public land, you're looking for food sources, whether it's a random clear cut, stand of white oaks, change of habitat from upland down to lowland swamp, hardwoods to cut edge. There's a lot of different levels of diversity you're looking for on public land. But when it comes to private land, creating that food plot, there's nothing else that you can do that will set the foundation on your land. And so a lot of times people want to get in there, you want to plant trees, want to prune apple trees. There's a lot of things that you can do over time, and they're really not impacting your hunt, and a lot of times even the wildlife that much right away. Let's say something, tree plantings or shrub plantings, they're going to impact your wildlife in 10, 12, 15 years. Waiting a year for something that's going to take 13 instead of 12 years isn't that big of a deal. But if you pushed off your food plots and you pushed off some of these top items right here to begin with, then you're always going to be behind, and the activities you complete will not be completed in an order that allows you to tap into your true potential of your land and your hunt, and certainly to be that herd influencer in the area. Number one, the food plots. It's by far number one. That's what sets the foundation of movement for your entire property. Once you have food plots, you can determine your access. You determine your access with the long food plots. That's how the two go together. Once you determine that, you can determine where your tree stands are located. You can determine where your tree stands and blinds are located because you have that afternoon food source movement. You have that foundation of movement, that number 3 feeding of the day. So once you have those food plots established, you not only have food source evening stand locations, movement to those stand locations. You can hunt midday cruising hours, afternoon, but then you also have those bedding areas that will now be full of deer because you're adding the food plot. No food, no bedding. There's a lot of dead acres out there where there's great deer habitat, great woods, great cover, great upland mix, but if you don't have that afternoon food source that they're hitting every single day that's consistent on your land, and that can't include agricultural land. Ag land is bad for setting that foundation of movement. It's always changing. If you have someone in your location or your region that on ag land is constructing a really well-designed food plot program, then you're eventually not going to see very many deer, if any at all, except for maybe deer in the rut. You don't want to have a parcel that you have to rely on good bucks to move through deer in the rut. That's what this parcel was before. They used 5 acres of beans. They had those plots. They didn't hit the mark because those beans were largely gone by sometime in early October. And so that's why a lot of our real estate pictures that we have are velvet pictures, not hardhorn, because although the bucks love those beans during the summer months, they weren't around during the end of October, November, December. So they had to rely on random mature buck movement through the area. And folks, I'll tell you, if you have good food plots somewhere else, a quarter mile away, then you're likely not going to see a lot of deer. Even that random movement gets shut down drastically. So the food plots are critical. That determines access, that determines tree stands and blinds. Once we have those tree stand locations picked out, I'm adding a mock scrape to almost every stand location. It's a quick enhancement. It's cheap. It's virtually free. We use paracord to hang a vine or a vertical branch. We use no commercial scent, because the best scent of all on those mock scrapes is the scent that every deer leaves by rubbing their preorbital gland scent on the branch. Please don't fall into the temptation of spraying some urine or unnatural scent on a licking branch. A lot of times you just have to wait for it to rain a few weeks, wash it off, and then they might start hitting that. Urine goes on the ground, but what you'll find is we watch scrapes basically for a living. That's what we do. But we're watching that scrape behavior, and when those bucks come in, and when deer come in, when fawns come in, they're going right to the licking branch and they're rubbing their preorbital gland scent on that. They're rarely, I would say less than 10% of the time all year, maybe even less than 5% of the time, they're actually scraping on the ground and making a scrape. So licking branch is critical. I like that big open patch under the mock scrape that deer can see. It's more of a calling card. If you're curious about mock scrapes, I have close to 40 mock scrape videos on a playlist. All my videos on YouTube on the channel, so you can check those out. I talk about how to make mock scrapes hundreds of times over, so I hope you enjoy that process. They're very powerful, but that's critical. I think last year, before we had the food plots, we were already designing them, and before we had stands in place, we were actually putting the mock scrapes in June, July sometimes, because we wanted to start identifying those bucks and those movements around those areas, get those deer accustomed to going through that area, and that gave us a really good inventory of all the bucks in the area. Even though during the summer months it was very random. Now, we did pick up new bucks in the fall, but a lot of those mature bucks, even though we didn't get pictures of them every single day because they were typically somewhere else during the summer, we still got enough footage to know how they like to move through the land and how they would relate to those stand locations. Once you have those in place, then obviously we're putting a trail camera over those mock scrapes. It is critical that you have a trail camera by your stand locations, not every single one. There's times where we've had 12, 13 stand locations or blinds on a property, and we've used 4 or 5 trail cameras. The more that you define the movement and the daily movement with food plots to bedding areas, and you recognize that movement, you're trying to identify bucks that are using that movement with the mock scrapes. The more you do that, the fewer cameras that you need. And that's a really important concept for you to understand. I've been to properties where they had 30 trail cameras on 100 acres, or 200 acres, or 15 on 80. And there's nothing wrong with that. I'm not saying that you shouldn't do that. You know, sometimes you have 15 tree stands on 80 acres and you put a camera on each one. That gives you a very accurate window of what's actually going through the property. However, to get an inventory of all the bucks in the area, you need 4, 5, 6, 7 cameras per 80 to 100 to 150 acres. And the more you define that movement, then the more you capture at least 95% of those bucks in the area throughout the season. There should rarely be surprises that show up in your area. So the trail cameras, we put in my stand locations. I want to be able to pull those cards when I use a stand. I want to be able to put a cell cam in that location. But bottom line, I want to see what's going on around those stand locations. To me, it's an opportunity to actually recognize and use deer movement and use that deer movement to your advantage. If you just put those trail cameras out on a field edge on a random scrape, then you might get some nighttime pictures, but it really doesn't tell you anything other than that buck is in that location. I want to know what he's doing by the stand. For that, we've talked about hiding our trail cameras for many years. We place a trail camera on a tree that's wider than the camera. We try to hide the profile by another trunk or brush nearby. And most importantly, we're putting those cameras at about 6, 7 feet. We find that just a handful of deer out of hundreds of pictures will ever look at that camera. If you have a camera in a location where 10, 20% of the deer that walk by are looking at that camera, you need to hide it more. That's a very bad thing, especially when you get into the higher pressure states. It's troubling because you can look at the Outdoor Channel, Sportsman's Channel, cable TV shows, hunting shows, and they might put a camera that's very obvious and right out in the open. Well, in some of those low pressure states, where in Kansas, for example, 25,000 bow hunters. I think Michigan had 425,000 bow hunters at one time. So 400,000 more people hitting the woods. And there's just so much more pressure applied. The deer get used to those cameras. They get used to that little box. So you have to hide them. And it's easy to do. What I found is people use gloves, try not to touch the camera with their fingers. We've found that doesn't have anything to do with anything, because if you touch that camera, that scent's not blowing at a deer when they walk by 10 minutes later so where they can smell it. And if you've hidden your camera enough, why would the deer smell the camera in the first place? We rarely have deer come up and lick the camera. Again, 6 feet in the air on a tree wider than the camera, no infrared or red bulb. infrared cameras, and that keeps them successfully hidden. Finally, switchgrass. Why switchgrass? It's more of a planting. Long term, you're looking at for decades to come, but it's easy to plant. If you can spray the ground 2 to 3 times, check out how to plant switchgrass. I have lots of videos out there about that. And it's something that's cheap and easy to do in that first year. We went over 4 ways to plant switchgrass recently. And it's pretty easy to get the job done with switchgrass. And because it's easy, even though it's something you're going to manage for decades, it's easy to get in. And by year 2, a lot of times that switchgrass is 6 to 8 feet tall in most areas. And you're going to offer enough cover and screening to get out of your stands better, to screen off your food plots, to make the deer feel more remote. And those are the things that we did personally in year 1. We added an archery range. There's areas we mowed, trails we opened in the woods for access. But really, when it came down to deer, these are the priorities, starting with a food plot. You can't put in a food plot program 5 years down the road and think that for those first 4 years, you're going to be able to tap into anywhere close to your potential. It all starts with that foundation of movement. That food plot provides that based on your access, making sure you're not walking and spooking the deer, walking through or over hunting those food plots and exposing your hunting pressure to those food plots. Once you do that, everything else falls in line. Now, year 2, we're stepping over. Someone said, I see a lot of apple trees if you address pruning them. Well, that's 2-3% of the puzzle. We're not going to design and build a quality deer herd or a quality hunt just purely because we have apple trees, especially when they're already producing some fruit. We have a lot of apple trees we can prune and make better, get the production up several times over, but it's not going to immediately give us that impact or even long term. It's something that as a steward of the land, we want to do, and we really want to take advantage of those really nice old apple trees we have on the property. But pruning those apple trees and planting fruit trees, whatever, that first year was not something that would have allowed us to tap into a high percentage of our potential. And like I say over here, you can't do year number 2 activities at the expense of year 1. What that means is pruning apple trees, planting trees, putting water holes in, creating bedding areas, creating travel corridors are all a huge investment in time. And so if you're completing those activities without creating the foundation, the access, the foundation of food, the movement every day, then you're behind. And a lot of your activities, that's great, you're getting them in, but you're not allowing yourself to create that herd, create that quality hunt. This is the foundation right here. Think of this as the foundation of a home. This is exterior walls. This is the layout of the kitchen, the living room, the dining room, the hallways, the bathroom. These are the finishing materials on the inside. After going through a remodeling project over the last 10 months, we've seen how quickly the contractors, the general contractor, Todd, can get the walls up, can get everything finished on the outside and make sure that the building is sound and that we're keeping the weather out. But boy, whether it was finishing the fireplace, bathrooms, closets, bedrooms, interior walls, painting, drywalling, the drywalling, I didn't realize how many steps they had to actually have good drywall, and then adding trim, the electrical. That's year 2 stuff if you look at it that way. We can't do that stuff first before you build the foundation. You're not going to work on a bathroom when you don't even have the foundation of the entire house, the exterior walls, the roof, the windows, everything else, the siding. So think of it that way. Pruning apple trees, I can't wait to do that. It's something I want to get into. It's something I'll enjoy personally. It'll be rewarding to see that we can go out there and increase the fruit production on those trees. Planting trees. Now there's a lot of people that need to plant trees, that need to plant screening trees. We don't have to plant a lot of trees. I want to plant red cedars back in the bedding areas that I've created, but those are not year 1 projects. Those take a lot of time. They take more planning. And in the end, that's that 5% of the puzzle, that 3% of the puzzle that you're completing. Again, it's not adding a huge amount to the overall property. It is long-term, but again, if those conifers are going to add something appreciable for cover in 12 to 15 years, another year is not going to matter. These first year projects matter. Water holes. I love water holes, you guys know that, but digging in water holes and getting those in, I put as a second year priority because we're already tapping into the deer movement. We already have the mock scrapes. We find that deer will hit mock scrapes several times over for water holes, before water holes. We even have them where we have combinations. They'll go to a water hole first, then a mock scrape, sometimes to a mock scrape and then a water hole. But when they're using those water holes most, is end of October, November, and they're using those mock scrapes year round. So a big difference between those two attractions and how it defines movement by your stand. We would always place a priority on mock scrapes over water holes. Now, if we had time, this water hole right here, these water holes, I would have moved that over to here if I had time. That is a first year project sometimes if you have time. But you might find that with just between food plots, access, and tree stands, mock scrape, trail cameras, that's a lot of work. We had a lot to do last year, and getting those in. So water holes are a priority. Could have moved them over to this list right here, potential number first year. Then bedding areas. Typically, unless you're buying that property in January, February, and a lot of these other projects can wait, then you're not completing those bedding area cuttings and bedding area work until year 2, which is what we did this year. We're starting to do that. We'll do more in August. So we're starting on our bedding areas, but we already have good hunting. We already have halfway decent habitat. And so because of the depth of cover we have and the ability to house deer within a big hollow and off to some big deep sides that travel all the way down to a creek system, we have that depth where we can hold deer. We can hold more deer. We can define that bedding more in the future by cutting, and the additional cuttings we'll make in year 2. But we could already lay out that foundation on the property without bedding area work until year 2. So we're completing that in year 2 right now. And then finally, travel corridors. Travel corridors are awesome, where you're connecting those dots between a bedding area and a food source, a bedding area and a bedding area for morning stands. A lot of times people are putting in a huge amount of effort into cutting travel corridors, bedding areas, and if you don't have that foundation of food, movement, tree stand locations, your hunter access, mock scrapes at the stand locations, trail cameras, you're not going to be able to benefit by creating bedding areas and travel corridors, because you're not going to have the deer that will relate to a highly defined movement on a daily basis. So I hope this makes some sense right here. The foundation of movement is critical. It is highly important, very important to get it done. And these right here are activities a lot of times, except with the exception of the water hole here. Your water holes can be very, very important. You know, we could make a case that they should be over here, maybe even before the switchgrass. But in our case, because of all the edge that we have around our land, the switchgrass was critical, and we had a great hunting season by not putting the water holes in, and we had a great hunting season because we addressed these things first. When you get to year 2 activities, these can blend into year 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Those are the things you think, okay, long-term improvements to the plan. But I can't stand when someone says you design a new property that you're hunting and it's going to take years to improve. That, folks, is simply not the case unless you don't prioritize these foundation activities of movement in that first year. So really, it doesn't take long. It took us a year. We bought the property in June. We had a great hunt in October, November, December. Shot some great bucks in the area, and we look forward to more to come. Now, I do think that as far as improvement goes, we can push age structure up a little bit for bucks. We can define that they're on our property a higher percentage of the time by working on bedding areas. We're improving food plots this year. We're adding a little bit more food plot space. We picked up another, I believe, an adjoining property, and we'll talk about that in the future. But very critical that we're getting these things in place, the foundation of movement first, and then we can let those year 2 things ride for a few years if we need to, because they're not going to capture that 80% of the potential that we can address while completing 20% of these projects in that first year. Let's face it, planting trees, even if we had miscanthus grass under power lines that we needed to plant, that's not something that we're going to plant that year. It takes 4, 5, 6, 7 years, depending on where you're at, for those to fill in. It's just like planting conifers, planting fruit trees, a lot of chainsaw work in those bedding areas. I did what I could in the spring. Travel corridors will probably be last in that entire picture. If you have flat land, hardwood, sometimes those travel corridors can be a higher priority because they're establishing almost a fort around the core area on the inside of your property. So you could make a case for travel corridors, especially in flat land where you have big open hardwoods, that you're using those as more of a fence around the outside of your property so you can't see in, deer can't see out. We have the luxury of the topography and elevation, so pretty easy to look at a topographical map and say, this is where the deer are going to travel based on saddles, benches, flats. and elevation change, steep ridges where they're not going to travel up and down, flat areas where they are. You can narrow it down pretty quick, and that helps us with thermals and everything else too. But hope that makes sense. You know, we're going to be starting these projects on another property year 1 and our current property on year 2. And you know, something interesting, you probably have seen all the nice bucks we've shot in Wisconsin over the years on a property that only has about 30 acres of cover. On that property, we have switchgrass, trail cams, mock shape, tree stands, blinds, access food plots. We haven't pruned any apple trees. We haven't planted any trees. We do have water holes. We've worked on about a ½ acre of bedding area, maybe an acre at the most. I'd say more like a ½ acre. And we've completed travel corridor work for about 50 yards, and that's it. We didn't have the time to do those things, and it's on someone else's land. We lease the land, so we're not going to put a lot of activities of these second year and beyond activities. And guess what? We're still capturing 80–90% of our potential, and it's all based on the foundation movement here. And that's property we've had for a long time, and we've been really happy with it. We're enjoying hunting it, you know, going to be hunting it again this year. I hope this helps you guys out, because this is a big thing we go over with our clients at the end of the day, you know, what should be doing first. Because ultimately, I want them to be successful immediately, and there's no reason to take for years to do so. And I want you to find success right now, this year. There's no reason to wait, especially when you start with these food plots here, and move on and concentrate on these first year projects to help your land and hunt, help you be the herd influencer for this fall. Hey guys, I really appreciate you watching today's video. We're out here having some fun today. We're planting some switchgrass, cutting some timber, making some bedding areas, but most importantly, we're putting it all together, and that's critical. Any habitat improvements you're making, you can't just make improvements because it's a good spot. You have to link those together so that helps your hunt this fall. Really, I encourage you to check out my web classes. The link is in the description. It's helped a lot of folks design their properties and do what we're out here having fun doing right now.